So much of the land was owned by knightly families. Glasney College down at Penryn, a great monastic teaching establishment, was in full swing. You may or may not have heard of it. It disappeared with the dissolution of the monasteries. But I'll come back now to 1270 and what was happening here. The records show a thriving fishery. What are those records? Well, to put it simply, in a way that we can all understand, think in terms of a tax return. The fishermen paid taxes in the form of fish, and there's a lot of documentation about this. A lot of it went as a stipend to the vicar and was called altarage or something like that, something to do with gifts for the vicar or a stipend for the vicar brought to the altar. But the accompanying records, which describe things as they were then, show that there was a large and thriving fishing industry here, and I mean large and thriving, involving 60 plus fishermen. The main occupation, which from that time or earlier lasted for hundreds of years, was seine fishing for pilchards, using a type of net called a seine net, which is spelled S-E-I-N-E, like the River Seine that runs through Paris. Now, I don't know the origin of that particular word. But seine netting for pilchards was what was going on, and all the documentation showed that that continued until the late 19th, even creeping into the 20th century. So that covers a lot of time. 60-odd fishermen, and it was a big operation. Seine fishing involved big nets, several boats to operate a big net, quite a lot of fishermen, and also investment. Now, the luckier or wealthier members of the fishing community might have been able to afford a share in a seine netting operation, but generally speaking, the records seem to show that gentlemen farmers, yeoman farmers, the lord of the manor, even the vicar, people of slightly greater education perhaps and slightly greater wealth, had the most shares in these fishing seine companies. There were an awful lot of them, and hundreds of years later they even had names. In the 19th century, these little companies, there was the Providence Seine, there was the Naples Seine, there was the Adventure Seine. They all had names of one kind or another, and the whole operation, as I say, involved quite a lot of investment and quite a lot of individuals to operate it. Now, I'm going to try and explain seine fishing. Not the processing of fish at the moment, I'll go into that directly, but seine fishing. A seine net could be up to a quarter of a mile long, and in its deepest part, it could be 60 feet deep. No doubt the headline, the one that was on the surface, in those days would float on glass balls, because that was what was used before cork started to be imported. And the line that lay on the bottom of the sea would be lead weighted. Now, these seine nets were heavy, long, made of hemp, and they would be loaded onto the back of a rowing boat. And generally speaking, in those days, the pilchards shoaled in close around the coast. That doesn't really happen in the same way anymore, but they shoaled in close around the coast. They came up the western approaches, and fishermen, of course, knew their habits, knew the pattern of behaviour. And the whole thing became highly organised. An individual called a hewer would be up on the cliff somewhere watching for the approach of pilchard shoals, I should say. Soles and turbot, yes, I'm getting confused. He would make a lot of fuss and shout and holler and signal with his arms. Sometimes they had flags to signal to fishermen on the beach or around the shore somewhere that a shoal was coming into sight, precisely where it was, and so on. And this net, which was loaded up in the back of a rowing boat, one end of it would be left on the beach in the hands of a number of people. And then it would be rowed around in a huge semicircle around the shoal, hopefully, and the other end then brought into the beach. So theoretically, you had fish trapped in an enormous semicircle of net. And then, usually what would happen would be there would be an effort to draw this net into the shore. If it was a very small catch, then the whole lot might be got in. If it was a much bigger catch and it could not be pulled even with half the village on each end of the warps, then small boats would go out into the semicircle with baskets or hand nets or whatever and get all the fish into the small boats and bring them ashore. So it was a highly involved, highly organised and highly skilled operation. And if we say that there was a huge fishery here in 1270, well, it didn't suddenly happen in 1270. It must have been evolving over centuries. So the settlement that we imagine here in, say, the 6th century in the time of St. Just must have evolved considerably to make Goran Haven one of the most important fisheries on the entire southwest peninsula. I'm going to try and summarise. The catch. What would happen with the catch? Well, in early days, I mean, people were poor. The fishermen were poor. There were others who owned shares in these seines who were wealthier. But in very, very early days, the probability is that these pilchards would be salted down for the local population for the winter. And even in very hard, much more recent times, when there was widespread poverty, then that would still happen. There is a story of, it was actually a ring net rather than a seine. A big catch was held in a ring net somewhere off here. We're talking now about somewhere around the 18th, 19th century. It was full of pilchards, but it came to midnight on a Saturday night and the fishermen would not fish on the Sabbath. So they left this net with a view to striking out at midnight as soon as the Sabbath was over, and it was all gone. And so that was the last shoot of the late autumn, and so the inhabitants went hungry in the winter. So that's the sort of thing that happens sometimes. Anyway, early times then, the catch distributed around the locality, but we also see in the middle of the medieval period a beginning of a very, very prosperous, or at least mostly, a prosperous export business, and I'll come to that in a minute. I'll just repeat that the records, wills and things like that show that pilchards and pilchard seining was the absolute mainstay of fishing from, well, very early times, before 1200, up to the late 19th century. I'll just read you one extract. I plan to do tons of these, but that just isn't time. One extract. Nicholas Devonshire died in 1666, and the inventory of his goods listed 1 cellar, or bulking house in Goran Haven, 3 parts in 4 of a pilchard seine, 1 boat with oars, press poles, stones, washing troughs, 2 mauns of salt, old and new salt. And you can find wills like that all over the place, associated with fishermen here over many centuries. The next key point in time, which gives us an idea of the size of the fishery here, 300 years later, to the year 1570, the authorities were collecting lists of names for seamen who would be suitable for manning ships in view of the threat of the Spanish Armada. The numbers for Goran Haven were 68, and interestingly, the numbers for Mevagissey were 8. We can assume from that that either the guys in Mevagissey turned tail and ran inland, or else that Mevagissey was completely underdeveloped, and that would be right, because it was. Mevagissey did not begin to develop as a fishing port until they started building the quays in the 17th century and into the 18th century. And then, of course, it overtook Goran Haven, eventually at least, because it was an all states of the tide harbour, whereas down here we're tidal and limited. 68 then for Goran Haven, which was among the largest in the West Country. Some familiar names start appearing at that time. Husbands, who are still around. Rouses, who are still around. Varcos, who are still around. Nichols. Even Olivers, and well, there's one or two of them around.